Welcome to CareTalk, America's home for incisive debate about healthcare business and policy. And we are at Health 2021 in Boston, our second time.
Wow.
It is a wow, John. It's the second, I would say annual, but we
Didn't
skipped
happen
a year.
last year.
No, that COVID thing. But it's the second time that we've done a series of high-profile, high-pressure interviews. Now, it's a live event, so if you hear any...
Our current guest is not high profile. How does he fit in? I'm John Driscoll for the CEO of CareCentrix. We are delighted to be at Health with all of the ambient noise in the background, which we are not faking. There are thousands of people here talking about the cutting-edge things in healthcare, COVID, what happens after COVID, the health inequities, pharma services, pharma exploration. Who is our first victim this morning?
Well, John, our first victim, he may not be high profile, but he's a very precise guy because he is Marc Clein from the Precision Medicine Group. And I think we're going to kick off and say welcome, Marc, first of all, in case you were wondering if you're welcome or not. You are.
Thank you. I would not say I'm not high profile. Would say I'm no profile.
No profile?
Yeah.
Well,
Nice.
that's sort of precision medicine, huh? Now, but just to give us some background, Marc, how many companies have you founded and sold in the last 3 or 4 years?
Well, first let's stretch that out to more like the last 20, but 3 different companies, actually 4. So,
Aren't you the math guy? You're supposed to kind of keep track of the companies you start and sell.
well, what happens is when you've been doing it this long, dementia does start to take its toll.
Well, we're here to talk today about this precision medical group thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, honestly, hasn't precision medicine, hasn't the arrival of precision medicine been announced for the last 30 years?
Well, you could say that. In some respects, precision medicine, before it was called precision medicine, there were examples of using a biological marker as a surrogate to predict whether a patient would respond to a particular drug. So maybe the best example of that is LDL as being as an indicator of heart disease that led to the development of the statins, or an even maybe better example,
Which is probably the most dramatic impact of medicine across the largest number of people ever by, sort of in the history of drug development in terms of lowering the risk of cardiac arrest and cardiac decline.
Great point.
It's massive. But I mean, dude, that was like 50 years ago, and we still don't have very precise medicine. So what are we talking about here?
Well, so then that's one example. A second example, which has a bit more precision and just as massive an impact, was CD4 cell counts with HIV. That was really the beginning of turning AIDS into a chronic disease.
Yeah.
And so both of those were examples of identifying some surrogate biological marker and then being able to build a drug around it. Because when you can do that, the difference is it fundamentally changes the clinical trial design. So now instead of just randomly enrolling patients and then allocating a certain number of patients the drug and a certain number of patients the alternative or a placebo, you're now recruiting patients based on that marker. Do you have high LDL, or in today's world, do you have a gene mutation? And if you can then recruit patients that you've already determined are more likely to respond, you can identify whether you have an effective drug with much smaller patient cohorts. And that allows you to shrink the time and cost of drug development. And that's what we're seeing in this kind of new age of precision medicine. Frankly, I think it's the biggest change in the life science industry since 1962, when they established randomized controlled trials as the necessary hurdle for drug approval.
Thereby making it slower and more difficult to get any drugs approved.
Well, and also creating some scientific basis for knowing whether something works.
So how is precision medicine different from personalized medicine? Or is it two ways of saying the same thing?
It's almost, yes, it's two ways of saying the same thing. What it turned out was that when we were using the term personalized medicine, it just turned out that doctors didn't like to be told that they didn't treat their patients personally. And on the other hand, when
you offended doctors, Marc? I mean, that doctors being offended, really, that's why we changed the terms?
Well, it affected adoption. As you know from your friend Dan Kahneman, how you
frame.
Yeah, how you frame things is very important. And when physicians saw that there was an opportunity to use precision, there was nothing threatening about that. When they were told you have to treat your patients on a personalized basis, they said, well, I'm doing that.
John, I thought you were more of an Amos Tversky guy.
Amos Tversky and Dan Kahneman are the famous Israeli-American economists who won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics, and both of my colleagues are sort of shame-dropping, name-dropping references that the average healthcare person may not know, but actually the behavioral economics, the importance of framing an argument when you want to drive actual change in behavior is actually, to Marc's point, I'm not going to give you any credit, David, one of the biggest challenges in healthcare is getting people to do the things we know they want to do. And I think of that as a patient problem, but you're absolutely right. If the docs aren't going to prescribe, but Marc, seriously, whether it's Genzyme or Genentech or Biogen, it feels like biotech companies have systematically, forget even big pharma, oversold the revolution in front of us, which has always felt a little bit more incremental than sort of system change. And yet, your point about personalization and leveraging data, I mean, why isn't it happening faster?
Okay, good points. I want to address your withering assault on precision medicine very directly.
You're up for it.
The big change that happened, it has been incremental, but you could ask the question, well, you just gave these examples of Lipitor and HIV, so this has been around a long time. Why are you calling it precision medicine suddenly?
You're kind of struggling. You have to go back to 1962. I mean, did anything happen after the First World War?
Well, the biggest thing that happened that has really fundamentally changed everything was the mapping of the human genome. And so the mapping of the human genome created an explosion, basically the mapping of the software code of humanity has created an explosion in academia in identifying all of these biomarkers, and particularly genetic-based biomarkers. And that's what was the difference. That in itself is incremental because that's still ongoing, but it's one of the great examples of public-private power. And because that investment that we made has created an explosion of biomarkers, which has now led to drug development that is now compressing, both in time and cost.
What about these massive timelines and all these tens of billions of dollars?
Let's talk about Operation Warp Speed, right? Because I think when COVID hit and we were looking what was going to happen.
I want to hear the story about drugs. We've already got the vaccines are here, but the drugs are late.
Exactly. But the vaccine got here quickly, okay? And every big experts like John over here would say, oh yeah, vaccine is going to take, takes 5 years at least to develop a vaccine, so on and so forth. And boom, all of a sudden they did it fast.
5 years to never. I mean, the average vaccine development took like 8 years, and we still don't have a vaccine for AIDS. I was really concerned that we wouldn't have one.
Right.
No,
it's truly revolutionary. 5 months later we have one because there was a focus on it. Now, how come, it was 1962? Okay, that goes way back. I mean, everything's relative, John. But
you're that old.
So, thalidomide, okay, there are clinical trials coming out of that. Now, how come we can't make therapeutics go so fast? Maybe we can.
Well, there are two comments there. Project Warp Speed is an incredible success, but it's not necessarily a model for the industry, because what Project Warp Speed fundamentally was a financing of the manufacturing process. That's why it was the process was so accelerated. Doing vaccine testing does not take a long time, particularly with an mRNA model. What takes a long time is finding out the results, which is what any rational pharmaceutical company would do, finding out the results and then scaling up manufacturing. You're not going to make the multi-billion-dollar manufacturing bet in advance. What the U.S. government did was they said, we'll pay for that. We'll take the risk on manufacturing so everybody could go, full out, and then if it did work, the manufacturing would be there. And that's exactly what happened. So that's not necessarily an example of.
But I don't want to lose your point earlier, Mark, because if it's true that precision can shrink and simplify drug development, that's kind of a revolutionary thing,
Correct.
particularly given all these fat cat pharma executives who claim it costs an infinite amount of money, which is why they should get infinite margins and why 1 out of 4 people can't afford their drugs in America. I mean, that potentially
undermines that argument completely.
But also creates potential, like cancer could be a chronic condition. I mean, that's a big claim. What sits underneath that hypothesis or maybe fact if it's changing that quickly?
Well, that is where we're heading. Let's take hemophilia. There's 3 products in development. We're supporting the development of one of those for gene therapy in hemophilia.
Wow.
One of these is going to work, and maybe multiple ones.
And for those who don't know, hemophilia it's a bleeding disease, effectively, it is from a genetic mutation, and these hemophiliacs need factor to stabilize themselves, and they are extremely expensive. A hemophilia patient could cost anywhere between $5 to $15 million a year personally. We have the ways to keep them alive. It is extremely expensive and invasive. That would be revolution. That's a game changer, Mark. If it actually is that on the horizon?
That is on the horizon. These studies are not going to take a long time because it's very clear if it works. Now there's a duration effect, but even if these hemophilia gene therapy approaches just result in not having to take factor, which is the current treatment, for 1 or 2 or 3 years, the implications are massive in terms of quality of life for the patient and the cost.
The cost thing, it is a huge lifestyle.
I guess, John, if you're starting and you're saying, well, it's $10 or $15 million a year now, I think it could be less, right? But the problem with gene therapy, it might be $3 million, which is less than 10 or 15, but most diseases aren't that much. And then there's concerns about gene therapy, whether it causes cancer. So are we going to actually is there's going to be like nuclear fusion? We're always just a little bit over the horizon for the cheap energy, too cheap to endless energy.
You bringing back nuclear again? I thought we were talking. This is a healthcare conference.
I am talking
David.
about it. It's the same thing.
Let's forget about it. The fusion.
I want to hear the hemophilia.
You just fell for all that fusion stuff.
It's just over the horizon, John.
Think hydrogen. Now, getting back to healthcare.
So there's sort of 2 ways to think about this precision medicine's benefits. One is the sort of game-changing examples where chronic diseases are cured or turned into diseases that are treated much more effectively at much lower cost. Another way to think about it is improved treatment like Xalkori, the Pfizer lung cancer drug. This was actually one of the landmark examples of precision medicine, of which there will be many, of which there are hundreds now in development. But that was an example of a product that would never have been approved in the traditional model. If you had given Xalkori to lung cancer patients randomly, just lung cancer patients, which is what its indication was, it would have shown a 5% response rate. And the FDA would not have approved it. However, if you give Xalkori to those patients that have the ALK mutation, you have a 40% response rate or 35% response rate, and it's a really powerful drug. And it turns out that the patients that have that mutation are disproportionately non-smoking women that have lung cancer.
So a completely different presentation
so
than
you
typical
get,
clinic.
What you have is a classic example of a product that ends up treating a disease that is called lung cancer, but is actually a subset linked to that gene mutation.
So,
no, go ahead, John. I don't want to cut off your line of questioning.
If this is so clear, what exactly do you do in this process? What does your current company, the Precision Medical Group, actually do to kind of accelerate, impair, or overcharge pharma companies from actually making progress?
So if you're going to pursue this type of drug development approach, you need a very different infrastructure than you would typically find in the typical research services CRO company.
Typically a clinical research organization, which are the typical organizations that big pharma uses to actually farm out the clinical trials for phase 1, phase 2, 3, all of the stuff in that trial thing, do they still pretty much outsource that to CRO organizations?
They do. Most clinical trials, or many clinical trials, about half of all drug development is outsourced to specialty companies like ourselves. The traditional companies in this space were essentially labor-driven data collection organizations that would go out and train sites that will be involved in treating the patients and then collect all of the information and then analyze the information and then provide that back to the drug company. Drug companies are really good at understanding how to develop drugs. They tend not to have internal expertise on diagnostics. And if you're going to use a precision medicine approach, it means that you've identified some biological marker that you think can predict response potentially, and then you need to turn that into a diagnostic test that you incorporate into the clinical trial so that you're ruling patients in or out versus these various biomarker tests. So what we do at Precision is we have an entire infrastructure and capability that's in the industry is called translational sciences that sources biospecimens, conducts the testing to validate the hypothesis of the biomarker, turns the biomarker into a diagnostic test, processes the samples in the clinical trials, and then designs and runs the clinical trial to integrate the biomarker into it.
Well, last question. So it's been 2 years since the last health conference, and whether it's 2 years or not for next time, we don't know, but will we be singing more or less the same tune in 2 years, or is there going to be something dramatically that changes in that time frame?
I think we're going to be singing that tune louder. I think we're going to be seeing a world where increasingly there's less waste, meaning there's less treatments prescribed by doctors that don't work. There's more treatments that work at higher cost, because I think we're moving to a world where these types of diseases will reduce cost by reducing the amount of treatment that's necessary over time, but prices will probably be higher per prescription.
No, I mean, I'm giving you a hard time, Mark, but it is really amazing what you're doing. You know, I had a sister who died of cystic fibrosis, and when she died in the 60s, what she was suffering from now is a chronic condition, and my niece, my cousin rather, has a son who's got cystic fibrosis, and he will live until old age based on the biologics that have been created in a precise way to solve that crippling disease. And so what you're doing is completely game changing, and I don't think we should underestimate the power of the slow, consistent movement towards precision medicine. But we can't pay the prices that pharma is charging. But that's for a different podcast.
Right.
Great. Well, we always like the different podcasts, John, if this one isn't any good. In any case, Marc Clein, CEO, co-founder of Precision Medicine Group, it's been a pleasure having you here today on the CareTalk podcast at Health 2021. I'm David Williams, president of Health Business Group.
Marc, thanks for joining us. And
Thank you.
Please subscribe on your favorite service.